On a burning afternoon in Thrace, thousands of Roman soldiers were extinguished without ever falling to the ground. The press of bodies was so absolute that the fallen remained standing, held upright by the weight of the living, their breath stolen not by enemy steel, but by the shields of their own comrades. In the center of this suffocating iron cage, the emperor of the civilized world did not fall like a king. He simply dissolved into the smoke, erased from history by the sheer density of panic. The sun over Thrace on the 9th of August, 378, was not a source of light, but a physical weight, an anvil of shimmering heat that pressed down on the helmets and shoulders of 40,000 men. They had marched for 8 miles since midday without water, moving over a plain that had been baked by the summer into a sheet of cracked, yellow ceramic. The air itself had a texture, a thick, greasy quality that made each inhalation feel like a sip of warm oil. It warped the horizon, turning the distant Gothic wagon circle into a wavering, indistinct smudge that floated in a pool of quicksilver. The world had lost its sharp edges, dissolving into a dreamlike haze where the only reality was the physical revolt taking place inside each man's arm. The legions were not yet fighting an enemy of iron and wood. They were engaged in a losing war against their own physiology. Their bodies, encased in iron scale and leather, had become personal ovens, draining the moisture from their skin faster than their hearts could pump blood. Discipline, the invisible architecture that held the Roman world together, could not countermand the simple, brutal fact of dehydration. As the lines deployed from the marching column, the movements were sluggish, marred by a collective tremor that ran through the ranks. Men swayed on their feet, their vision blurring at the edges, their tongues heavy and useless in their mouths, making every breath a struggle. A low collective groan, too deep to be a sound and more like a vibration in the ground, replaced the usual sharp commands of the centurions. They believed they were marching to punish a barbarian uprising, to reassert the unshakable logic of Roman order upon a chaotic frontier. This belief was a thin, brittle shell around the harsh reality of their condition. The heat was not merely weather, it was a tactical element, a form of attrition that was dismantling the army from the inside out before a single spear was thrown. The soldiers gripped their pila with hands that felt clumsy and disconnected from their bodies, their minds clouded by a fog of thirst that was more terrifying than any war cry. They were a machine designed for shock and momentum, but its internal mechanisms were seizing up, gummed with dust and starved of the water that was its lifeblood. They had walked voluntarily into a furnace that had been preheated for their arrival, and the door was slowly swinging shut behind them. To the Roman command, the unfolding situation did not look like a disaster. It looked like a mathematical equation that had already been solved. The sprawling circle of Gothic wagons, visible through the shimmering heat waves, presented itself as a static, defensive shell, the desperate fortification of a tribe that had run out of space to maneuver. The logic of the empire was built on the certainty of such geometries. Barbarians ran, and when they could no longer run, they huddled, and when they huddled, they fell. The intelligence reports that had reached the emperor's tent earlier that morning had been precise and seductive, estimating the Gothic force at merely 10,000 fighting men. It was a number that made the suffering of the march acceptable, for it promised a ratio of 4-to-1 in favor of Rome. This was the arithmetic of inevitable victory, a calculus that whispered to Valens that he did not need to wait for the reinforcements marching from the west. To wait would be to share the glory. To strike now against a cornered and numerically inferior enemy was to secure a triumph that belonged solely to the east. The suffering of the soldiers, their thirst and their exhaustion, was deemed a manageable variable in this grander equation, a cost of doing business in the currency of war. This illusion of control was reinforced by the very landscape that was slowly turning against them. When the first plumes of smoke began to rise from the dry scrubland, drifting lazily on the wind toward the Roman lines. The officers interpreted it not as a tactical masterstroke, but as a confession of fear. The Goths were burning the grass to screen their movements, a classic ploy of an army terrified of the collision to come. The Roman military machine, drilled for centuries to ignore the theatrics of the enemy, responded with a terrifying, mechanical calm. As the fires spread, crackling through the brittle vegetation and sending thick, gray curtains of ash rolling over the plain, the legions did not break. They tightened. The centurions walked the lines, their voices cutting through the hiss of the burning earth, ordering the files to lock shields and close the gaps. The response to the environmental threat was a rigid adherence to structure. If the air was becoming unbreathable, the solution was to stand still, to conserve oxygen, and to trust that the formation was a sanctuary that could weather any storm. The smoke was an irritant, a temporary blindness, but the wall of shields was eternal. The confidence of the army was anchored in what they could not see. The hills surrounding the plain were empty, a vacuum of information that the Roman command interpreted as safety. In their experience, a threat was something visible, a mass of men, a cloud of dust raised by hooves, the glint of iron on a ridge. The absence of the Gothic cavalry, the renowned heavy horsemen who had plagued the frontier for years, was read as proof that the enemy had been fractured. The logic was linear and comforting. If the cavalry was not on the field, they must have fled, or perhaps they had never arrived. The Romans looked at the empty horizon and saw a canvas for their own maneuvering, unaware that the emptiness was not a void, but a curtain. They assumed that the battle would be a contest of infantry against infantry, a grinding match of weight and discipline, where the heavier, better-armored legions would inevitably crush the lighter, undisciplined barbarian mob. They were preparing for a wrestling match, unaware that they were standing in the path of a landslide. Under the darkening sky, where the sun was now a red disk filtered through layers of drifting soot, the army finished its deployment. It was a magnificent, terrifying display of order in the midst of a developing inferno. 40,000 men stood in perfect lines, the scales of their armor reflecting the dull glow of the approaching fires. They were the heirs of a system that had conquered the known world by imposing straight lines upon the chaos of nature, and they believed that this day would be no different. The smoke stung their eyes, and the heat radiated from the ground like a physical blow. But they did not move. They stood their ground, waiting for the order to advance, convinced that their discipline was a shield against the elements themselves. They were secure in the knowledge of their numbers, secure in the absence of the enemy horse, and secure in the belief that the smoke was merely a screen for a breaking enemy. The trap was fully set, the variables were locked in place, and the Roman army, blinded by its own competence, stood ready to perish for a calculation that had been wrong from the very beginning. The battle did not begin with the grand, unified blast of the cornua, nor with the decisive gesture of an emperor, but with a spasm of indiscipline that should have been the first screaming siren of the catastrophe to come. The Roman left wing, composed of auxiliary skirmishers and eager archers, simply lost its patience. Driven mad by the heat and the taunts drifting through the smoke, they surged forward without orders, a ragged, unauthorized wave breaking against the Gothic line. It was a tactical hiccup, a moment where the intricate nervous system of the legion misfired. But instead of pulling back to restore the geometry of the line, the rest of the army followed the error. The main body of the infantry, seeing their comrades engaged, interpreted the chaos as a command and stepped forward into the haze. To the officers watching from the rear, this ragged start was annoying but rectifiable. They viewed it as an excess of spirit, a sign that the men were eager to break the enemy. They did not see it for what it was, the first structural crack in the dam, a sign that the army was no longer a single, controlled mind, but a collection of suffering bodies reacting to the stimulus of strain. The collision, when it finally came, was muffled by the heavy air. The Roman shield wall smashed into the Tervingi infantry defending the wagon circle, but the impact lacked the crisp, shattering force of a fresh assault. It was a collision of exhausted men, a slow-motion grinding of wood against wood, where the sheer weight of the Roman column tried to displace the barbarian mass through hydraulic pressure rather than kinetic shock. For a deceptive, mesmerizing hour, the battle appeared to function exactly as the textbooks dictated. The Goths gave ground. They stepped back, foot by agonizing foot, compressing themselves against their wagons. To the Roman centurions, blinded by sweat and the tunnel vision of combat, this retreat looked like the prelude to a rout. They felt the enemy yielding and assumed it was weakness. They did not understand that the Goths were not breaking, they were compacting. The resistance was not brittle, like a wall about to shatter, but elastic, like a spring being coiled tight. The Romans were not pushing through a broken door. They were squeezing themselves into a bottleneck, trading the safety of maneuverability for the illusion of forward momentum. This false feedback loop, forward motion equals victory, seduced the high command into committing their gravest error. Seeing the center of the Gothic line bowing backward, the Emperor Valens ordered the reserves to join the fray. It was a decision born of the desire to end the ordeal quickly, to apply maximum force to a cracking point. Fresh units, the pride of the Eastern Field Army, were fed into the furnace, marching into the smoke with their heads high, believing they were the hammer that would strike the final blow. By committing the reserves, the Romans stripped themselves of the ability to react to any new variable. They had placed all their chips on the table, betting everything on the assumption that the battlefield was a closed system containing only the enemies they could see. The density of the formation increased to a critical mass. Men were packed so tightly that they began to lose their footing, not from enemy blows, but from the jostling of their own comrades. The gaps between the files vanished. The ability to turn, to pivot, to face a new threat was sacrificed for the singular, linear obsession with the wagon circle. Yet, amidst the roar of the melee, there were subtle anomalies that went ignored. The Gothic archers, usually so vocal, had fallen strangely silent, conserving their ammunition for targets they could not yet see. The smoke on the flanks swirled in patterns that suggested movement, but the scouts were too engaged in the center to investigate. The heat did not abate. It intensified, trapped between the walls of bodies, creating a localized climate of suffocation that sapped the strength of the legionaries even as they advanced. The army was winning the fight for the wagons, but it was losing the fight for situational awareness. They had achieved a dominant position in a room that was burning down, oblivious to the fact that the exit had been locked behind them. The silence from the hills should have been terrifying. The absence of the enemy cavalry should have been the loudest sound on the field. But the Romans heard only the grunts of the infantry war, interpreting the void on their flanks as a vacancy rather than a holding breath. They were pushing the spear point deep into the enemy, unaware that by doing so, they were fully extending their arm, leaving the body exposed, unbalanced, and perfectly positioned for the severing blow that was already thundering toward them from the unseen ridges. The sound arrived before the sight, a low-frequency trembling in the earth that cut through the cacophony of the infantry brawl like a thunderclap heralding a storm. The Greuthungi cavalry, returning from their foraging with perfect, accidental timing, descended from the hills not as a tactical unit, but as a landslide of horse and lance. They struck the Roman left wing with such kinetic force that the legionary cavalry did not fight. They simply evaporated, swept from the field like debris in a flood. The impact was instantaneous and irreversible, shattering the protective shell of the army and exposing the soft, crowded infantry center to a flank attack that they had no room to counter. The trap had not just snapped shut, it had been welded closed by the sudden, crushing presence of thousands of heavy horsemen driving the Romans inward. The immediate consequence was not a rout, but a horrifying physical condensation. The Roman infantry, already packed tight to push against the wagon circle, now found itself being compressed from the flank with the force of a hydraulic press. The space between men, which was the essential currency of combat, vanished entirely. The files did not merely close, they fused. A soldier in the fifth rank found himself pinned against the back of the man in the fourth, while the shield of the man in the sixth dug into his spine. The discipline that had been drilled into them for 20 years, the instinct to close ranks, to stand shoulder to shoulder, now conspired to undo them. They obeyed the logic of the formation, tightening to repel the cavalry, but in doing so, they created a density that violated the basic laws of physiology. The army was no longer a collection of fighting units. It was a single, solidified block of iron and flesh that had become too heavy to move and too dense to breathe. Inside this crushing enclosure, the temperature spiked to levels that the human body was never designed to endure. The ambient heat of the August afternoon, already punishing, was now compounded by the body heat of 40,000 struggling men and the stifling insulation of heavy armor. The air, thick with dust and the lingering smoke of the grass fires, became a finite resource. Men gasped for oxygen but found their rib cages pinned by the pressure of the crowd, unable to expand enough to draw a full breath. The scutum, the curved shield that was the symbol of Roman invincibility, transformed into an instrument of agony, clamping the chest and turning the legionaries' own defense into a vice. Arms that held swords were pinned to sides, rendered useless not by enemy action, but by the sheer proximity of friendly troops. The system of the legion was still technically intact. The standards were held high, the lines were ostensibly straight, the officers were screaming orders, but the machinery had seized. It was a paradox of order. The formation was so perfect, so tight, and so disciplined that it had paralyzed itself. The noise of the battlefield shifted from the sharp, metallic ring of swordplay to a dull, wet roar of compression. It was the sound of leather straining, of wood splintering under stress, and the groans of men whose strength was slowly failing under the weight of the press. The soldiers on the periphery were fighting desperately to keep the cavalry at bay, but for the thousands trapped in the interior, the war had become an abstract concept. They could not see the enemy. They could only see the sweat-drenched neck of the man in front of them and the dust swirling overhead. They were trapped in a standing coma, fully conscious but physically negated, waiting for the shock waves of the outer battle to transmit through the mass and squeeze the life out of them. The hierarchy of command broke down not because of cowardice, but because communication became physically impossible. A centurion could not turn his head to issue an order, and a runner could not move 3 feet to deliver it. The brain of the army was severed from its limbs, leaving a convulsing, suffocating giant that was slowly fading out under the relentless sun. The limit had been reached. The Roman army was still standing, it was still armed, and it was still technically fighting, but as an organism, it was already lost. The legions ceased to be an army and became a geological deposit of flesh, a calcified stratum where the individual soldier was erased by the crushing weight of the collective. The smoke, trapped within the shrinking circle of men like water in a bowl, grew denser with every passing minute, mixing with the heavy smell of iron and the sour reek of 40,000 sweating bodies to create a toxic, unbreathable miasma. Inside this cauldron, the vaunted Roman discipline metastasized into a mechanism of undoing. The instinct to hold the line, drilled into the muscle memory of every legionary, now served only to keep them locked in place for the end. The files were compressed so tightly that the concept of movement became a cruel memory. Soldiers perished standing up, held vertical by the pressure of their neighbors, their knees locked in a final rigor while their eyes stared blindly into the back of the helmet in front of them. Their breath was stolen not by Gothic naces, but by the shields of their own comrades, the iron rims pressing against chests until the lungs could no longer inflate. Men screamed for space, for air, for a chance to strike back. But their cries were swallowed by the roar of the collapse and the sizzling hiss of the grass fires that continued to burn around their feet. The dismantling at the periphery was industrial in its efficiency. The Gothic cavalry and infantry worked the edges of the Roman mass like harvesters clearing a field, striking at the paralyzed outer ranks who could neither retreat nor raise their weapons to parry. The Romans on the edge were pushed onto the barbarian spears by the terrified surge of their own rear ranks, driven forward in a desperate attempt to escape the crushing pressure of the interior. There was no tactical maneuvering left, only a grim erosion of the living surface area. As the outer layers were peeled away, the pressure on the center did not alleviate. It intensified as the survivors instinctively recoiled, compacting the core even further. The ground beneath them, baked hard by the summer sun, turned into a slick, treacherous slurry of dust and mire, causing men to lose their footing and slide into the gaps, where they were instantly pressed into the earth by the blind, shuffling weight of the mob. To fall was the end, but to stand was merely to wait. In the heart of the press, the Emperor Valens was no longer a ruler, but merely another piece of debris caught in the ruin. The purple of his robes was indistinguishable from the darkness of the mud and the gray of the ash. His bodyguards, trapped in the same hydraulic vice as the common conscripts, could not draw their swords to defend him. The chain of command had dissolved into a series of localized, terrified spasms. The standards, the golden eagles, and the Draco banners that symbolized the eternal power of Rome still swayed above the crowd, but they were held aloft by hands that were rapidly losing their strength, or wedged upright between the bodies of the fallen, mocking the order they were meant to represent. The heat inside the formation spiked to lethal levels, a wet, suffocating thermal shock that overwhelmed the senses and stopped hearts long before the enemy weapons could reach them. It was a mass collapse, a systemic biological failure of 40,000 organisms simultaneously denied the ability to cool down or breathe. The army was not being defeated by superior tactics. It was being digested by the physics of its own fear, consumed by a trap where the walls were made of Roman iron and the ceiling was made of Gothic smoke. The system had worked perfectly until the very end, ensuring that every man stayed in his place, maintained his rank, and kept his shield up, right up to the moment where obedience became synonymous with extinction. The silence that descended upon the plain of Adrianople after nightfall was heavier and more suffocating than the smoke that still drifted low over the cooling earth. It was not the peace of a finished task, but the stunned, ringing quiet of a world that had been violently rearranged. The battle had ceased not because of a surrender or a tactical withdrawal, but simply because there was no one left to resist. The Roman army, once a disciplined grid of 40,000 distinct lives, had been transformed into a single, static topography of ruin. In the pale light of the rising moon, the field did not look like a place of war. It looked like the site of a natural disaster, a landslide of bronze and flesh that had settled into the hollows of the terrain. The mounds of the fallen were so high that they blocked the wind, creating stagnant pockets of heat where the smell of iron and dust hung suspended in the air. The compression that had ended them was preserved in a final stillness. Men remained locked in the desperate, intimate embraces of the crush, fused together in clumps of 10 or 20, their limbs tangled in a knot that the looters found difficult to untie. There was no dignity in this tableau, only the brutal physics of space and volume, a final testament to the fact that the legion had been undone, not by weapons, but by its own density. The victors moved through this landscape like ghosts, their torches casting long, dancing shadows across the faces of the lost. The Goths were too exhausted for jubilation. Their movements were slow and mechanical as they stripped the armor from the fallen, collecting the iron harvest of the empire. They walked atop the carpet of bodies because there was no bare ground left to step on, their boots sliding on the slick, dark mud that the heat had not yet dried. They were looking for something specific, turning over the dead with the indifference of laborers, searching for the purple crest or the golden diadem that would signify the end of the emperor. But the field refused to yield him. Valens, the Augustus of the East, had been so thoroughly metabolized by the chaos that he had ceased to exist as a distinct entity. Whether he lay beneath a heap of common conscripts, his face pressed into the dirt, or whether he was merely ash in the ruins of a nearby cottage that had burned to the foundation, was a secret the battlefield kept. This absence was more terrifying than his remains would have been. It signified that the structure of the empire, the divine hierarchy that placed the emperor above the soldier and the soldier above the barbarian, had been completely dissolved. In the democracy of the crush, the ruler of the world was just another unit of volume, erased by the same pressure that claimed the peasant. The consequences of the day began to radiate outward, invisible shockwaves that would crack the foundations of the ancient world. Two-thirds of the Eastern field army lay silent in the Thracian dust. The veterans, the centurions, the tribunes, the living repository of centuries of military institutional memory, were gone. The training, the discipline, and the intricate system of command that made Rome eternal had been wiped out in a single afternoon. There was no one left to teach the recruits how to hold the line. There was no one left to remember how the machine was supposed to work. The border, which had stood as a rigid line between civilization and the wild for 400 years, had evaporated. The Goths were no longer outside the gate. They were the gatekeepers, standing on the chest of the empire they had just brought to its knees. As the night deepened, the wolves began to gather at the edges of the light, drawn by the scent of the aftermath, howling into a silence that would never again be broken by the confident, marching rhythm of the Roman legions. The sun would rise tomorrow on a new era, one where the map remained the same, but the fear had changed sides forever.